Hello and welcome to Candid Conversation. Our guest this week is Vivek Debroy. He's a noted economist who wears many hats with ease. He is a member of the Niti Aayog, author, columnist. He's translated epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana from Sanskrit to English, to name just a few of his accomplishments. Today we will speak to him on GST, governance reforms, the focus areas of Niti Aayog and his interests in Sanskrit and the epics. Welcome Mr. Debroy to Candid Conversation. Let's begin with GST, which has been 10 years in the making now. You have said in the past that the essential objective of GST is harmonization of all indirect taxes and that an ideal GST should be one that should have no exemptions. Would you say that the GST that is going to be rolled out on the 1st of July achieves that objective?
I think there are two ways to look at it. We have got an ideal GST where, as you said, that all indirect taxes are subsumed under GST and one has a single rate without any exemptions. That's the ideal GST. One way to look at it is to say that we can debate it, continue to argue about it until we have a consensus, wait for another 20 years before we have that ideal GST. The other way to look at it, which is the way I look at it, is that that's the terminal goal and it's the beginning of a process. So what we've got is obviously not perfect, but let's understand that it is the beginning of a process. In no country in the world has anything like a GST been accomplished overnight.
Consumers are concerned, Mr. Debroy, about the impact that GST would have on the prices of goods and services. What would that impact be according to you?
Well, again, there are several ways of looking at it. One way to look at it is in the aggregate. The rates are going to be revenue neutral, which means in the aggregate, the rates are going to be exactly what they are today, except that today as a consumer, when I pay, I don't necessarily know the extent of indirect taxation, whereas in the case of GST, it becomes completely transparent. The second response is forget the aggregate and I just look at the two broad sectors, let's say services and goods. In many, we still don't know what the revenue neutral rate is going to be. Let's assume it's something around 17-18%. The broad point being that for goods, many goods, the rate will come down. For many services, the rate will go up. So therefore, despite what I said about the revenue neutrality in the aggregate, as a consumer, I will pay more for services, less for goods. That's the trade-off. The last bit I want to mention is that the chain is going to be extended of GST, and therefore people who earlier were not part of the net will now become part of the net.
So the tax net would increase in terms of indirect taxes.
More importantly, many of us as consumers, we went to buy this, that and the other and said kacha receipt, which meant that the person was not paying the legitimate taxes. For that segment, now the prices will go up in the short run, but also remember GST brings efficiencies. So in the long run, prices should actually come down.
So you are saying kacha receipts would disappear once the GST comes
part
into
of it,
force.
Because not everyone becomes part of the net.
Okay. But the objective is, of course, to get as many people as possible in the tax net and to ensure that evasion is minimized. On the impact of GST on GDP, there are estimates that have appeared in the media that the growth rate could increase by 1 or 2%. Do you agree with that estimate? Also, what will be the impact of GST on employment generation?
Well, the two are related, but this is a tough one to answer because whatever estimates that exist are always imperfect because they have to be made on the basis of very, very heroic assumptions. But whatever estimates have been made are not about what's going to happen this year or that year. These estimates are all about that terminal GST, which will happen somewhere down the line, that ideal GST. So if anyone is suggesting...
Any timeline that you are looking at for that?
No, the only way you can think of a timeline is if you look at other countries which have gone through a process and similar process. And in those countries, it's taken at least 10 years. So to expect that suddenly this year GDP is going to go up by 1.5%, that's very naive and unrealistic. And therefore, any number that one is going to tag on employment generation is also extremely artificial. That's not really what this is about.
But will the quality of employment generation improve?
Because it brings efficiencies as a positive fallout, yes, but not per se because of GST, because what GST does is it reduces compliance costs for companies and establishments. It makes it easier to comply with taxation. It unifies, harmonizes, simplifies, and all of this is a process. So therefore it makes life simpler for everyone.
So maybe you're looking at 2027 for that terminal goal to be achieved in broad terms.
Well, I said broadly it takes 10 years. Broadly it takes 10 years. And remember, as we go along, there will be tweaking. We will need to integrate many more products. We need to remove the exemptions, because there will be exemptions in two senses. Firstly, some products will be outside the purview of GST, and some products will have rates that are below the standard revenue neutral GST rate.
2016, Mr. Debroy, was a year of reforms because the Monetary Policy Committee was set up. Not just that, laws like the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Code or the Aadhaar law were passed by Parliament, and even demonetization was announced. 2017, we started off again on a reformist note with several reforms in the budget that we saw that was presented, in fact, 28 days in advance. What are the focus areas in terms of reforms that the Niti Aayog is currently working on?
To me, the biggest reform undertaken by this government is institutional in nature. So it is not about Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act. What do I mean by institutional? I mean greater decentralization, of which fiscal devolution is only one. I mean the replacement of the Planning Commission with the Niti Aayog, which has a different mandate. I mean the involvement of citizens into the governance process, whether it is through the discourse on demonetization or the Swachh Bharat scheme or the voluntary relinquishment of LPG subsidies, all of this. Institutional change is also reflected in the end of the railway budget as we knew it, the end of the planned versus non-planned distinction, all of that. From that point of view, I think the biggest reform this particular year is not going to be something that you would normally include as big ticket, which is privatization or disinvestment, but the transition in government expenditure. Because this is the first year when state governments will revamp the expenditure schemes in the light not just of the 14th Finance Commission, but the restructured centrally sponsored schemes. So the restructuring of public expenditure, the basket, that to my mind is going to be the biggest change this year, spliced with the fact that this year the budget has been brought forward by a year. So public expenditure, therefore, given the cycle, monsoon cycle that we go through, should be more efficient this year. So that is what I think is the most important one this year.
The Niti Aayog has also worked out its 3-year action plan, a 7-year strategy plan, and 15-year vision document. What are the thrust areas in these documents?
The building blocks or the two fundamental principles are very simple. Niti Aayog is entrusted with the task of what used to be called perspective planning, which is break away from the 5-year plan cycle and look forward 15 years down the line to see what the country ought to be doing. And in that process, don't build from the top, but build up from below, from bottom up. It's decentralized planning, which is now a constitutional mandate also. In this, there are two principles which are important. Principle number one, every citizen in the country, wherever he or she happens to reside, must have access to a certain minimum basket of public goods and services. Doesn't matter where that person is. And you can see this reflected in many of the initiatives that the government has undertaken. The second principle is that there must be a better business environment for every entrepreneur. And notice that I'm using the word entrepreneur, I'm not using the word corporate manufacturing entity. The business environment must be better, more benign for every entrepreneur everywhere in the country. And third, perhaps I could add to that, that to the extent there are subsidies and public expenditure, that must be better targeted and one must monitor. Now, whatever Niti does in terms of this document builds on those principles. Overall, there's a vision of where we want India to be 15 years down the line, building bottom up. From that, you distill it down to a strategy, a 7-year strategy, and you distill it further to a 3-year action plan.
Okay. On the question of demonetization, it's been over 5 months since that announcement was made. In hindsight, what are the benefits that have flowed from the decision?
Well, there are various things that people thought this was meant to do. Some of those were not very important, so I will not get into issues of creation of fresh black income that's to be addressed in other ways. I will not get into issues of what happens to the black that existed in non-cash forms. This is more importantly an attempt to institutionally cleanse the system, and therefore to start off with, it should never have been evaluated and gauged on the basis of a narrow economics-based cost-benefit calculation. That's not what this is about. Had that been the case, probably most economists would have said that the costs are not worth the benefits. The benefits are the institutional cleansing. Having said that, we still don't know what the figures actually are because the RBI has not given us the figures, but quite evidently, a large part of the cash that was floating around in the system, some of which was black, either because it was illegal or because taxes had not been paid on it, have now been brought into the banking system. That does not mean that they have been legitimized in any fashion. They have been brought into the system and they will only be legitimized subject to further scrutiny. Cash that's sitting outside the banking system is useless. It does not fetch returns to you, nor does it perform the multiplier benefits that it is supposed to perform, that cash is supposed to perform for the growth of the economy. So in that narrow sense, the biggest benefit has been that some unproductive cash, whatever be the number, and I'm not going to give numbers right now, has now been brought into the banking system.
Fair enough. So you are saying that demonetization has given a push to a less cash economy. On that note, we'll take a break. You're watching Candid Conversation. Our guest this week is Vivek Debroy, noted economist and member of Niti Aayog.
रुखसाना, आज भी तुम अपना फॉर्म भरने पोस्ट ऑफिस नहीं आई?
आप तो जानते हैं शीला जी, दानिश के अब्बू तो अब रहे नहीं, बाहर के हर काम के लिए दूसरों के भरोसे रहना पड़ता है।
तो अब निकलो। अल्पसंख्यक मंत्रालय की इस नई रोशनी योजना में तुम जैसी हजारों महिलाओं में नेतृत्व क्षमता को बढ़ाया जा रहा है।
आज की औरत अब घर से खुद बाहर आएगी और बनाएगी अपना जीवन बेहतर। अल्पसंख्यक मंत्रालय की नई रोशनी योजना आपके लिए, सीखें और सशक्त बने।
मदद हमारी, मंजिल आपकी।
जैसे सूट टाइप, मुझे ये ग्रीन या फिर ब्राउन। ठीक है, आप ये पैक कर दी। सेब कितने का दिया?
बच्ची को संतरा ही पसंद है, यही दे दीजिए।
अगर आप माँ बनने वाली हैं, तो HIV टेस्ट जरूर करवाएं। बच्चे को HIV से बचाने के लिए जल्द ही पता लगाना और वक्त पे दवाई दिलवाना जरूरी है।
करें वही जो बच्चे के लिए हो सही।
हर सरकारी अस्पताल के ICTC में HIV की जांच एवं सलाह मुफ्त और गोपनीय है।
12वीं में मुझे 60% मार्क्स मिले हैं। BA MA करने के बजाय मेडिकल में जाना चाहता हूँ।
हम स्टूडेंट्स को जिनकी पारिवारिक आय 2.5 लाख से कम है, उन्हें प्रोफेशनल और टेक्निकल कोर्सेज में आगे की पढ़ाई के लिए ये स्कॉलरशिप दी जा रही है।
एक मजे की बात, हम गर्ल्स स्टूडेंट्स के लिए 30% स्कॉलरशिप अलग से निर्धारित है।
फ्रेंड्स जल्दी करो, फॉर्म्स ऑनलाइन जमा हो रहे हैं।
मेरिट कम मींस स्कॉलरशिप भारत सरकार की ओर से सभी अल्पसंख्यक स्टूडेंट्स को एक तोहफा उनके सुंदर भविष्य के लिए।
मदद हमारी, मंजिल आपकी।
सरिता जी, इन दिनों आप अपने खान पान का ध्यान तो रखती हैं ना? अरे ये क्या, भोजन में साधारण नमक? आयोडीन युक्त नमक का इस्तेमाल करें। आपके शरीर में आयोडीन की कमी से आपका शिशु शारीरिक और मानसिक रूप से कमजोर हो सकता है। आयोडीन नमक इन सारी परेशानियों से आपको बचा सकता है। ये नमक बाजार में आसानी से उपलब्ध है। बच्चों को हंसता खेलता बचपन दें, अपनी संतान का भविष्य संवारें।
सवारी जिंदगी चुटकी भर नमक, आयोडीन नमक।
खाना रखा है अब्बू, खा लो। ठीक है फरदीन।
11वीं क्लास में एडमिशन मिल गया?
हाँ जी शुक्रिया। मेरे अब्बू मुझे पढ़ा लिखा कर बड़ा आदमी बनाना चाहते हैं। शुक्र है हमारे सपने को पूरा करने के लिए हमें मिल रही है अल्पसंख्यक कार्य मंत्रालय की तरफ से पोस्ट मैट्रिक स्कॉलरशिप।
अल्पसंख्यक समुदाय के उन स्टूडेंट्स के लिए है जिनकी सालाना पारिवारिक आय 2 लाख रुपए से कम है और जिन्होंने मैट्रिक में 50% अंक प्राप्त किए हैं, और लड़कियों के लिए 30% स्कॉलरशिप निर्धारित है।
मदद हमारी, मंजिल आपकी।
प्रधानमंत्री ग्राम सड़क योजना ने हम गाँव वालों के लिए तरक्की के रास्ते खोल दिए।
सड़क के गड्ढों की फोटो खींच रहे हो? कोई खास बात है क्या?
अरे काका, मेरे मोबाइल फोन में मेरी सड़क ऐप है, जिससे प्रधानमंत्री ग्राम सड़क से जुड़ी कोई भी जानकारी सरकार तक भेजी जा सकती है। सड़क से जुड़े सुझाव या शिकायत पर सरकार वाजिब कार्यवाही करती है।
प्रधानमंत्री ग्राम सड़क से जुड़ी कोई भी बात मेरी सड़क एंड्रॉइड ऐप अब हर पल मेरे साथ।
अरे सुन तो।
मुझे क्या सुनाना चाहते हो? जो सुनाओ मेरी सौतन को।
किसको?
अरे वही तुम्हारा मोबाइल फोन जिससे सुबह शाम दिन रात चिपके रहते थे और कहते थे किसान कॉल सेंटर से बातें हो रही हैं।
अच्छा ये बात है।
हाँ क्यों, क्या हुआ? अब बात नहीं होती क्या?
अब तो झट से बात हो जाती है।
ऐसा क्या?
हाँ, अब तो ज्यादा लाइनें और खास तकनीक के कारण खेती के माहिरों से तुरंत बात हो जाती है। और अगर कभी लाइन व्यस्त हो तो अपनी समस्या फोन पर रिकॉर्ड करा दो, वहाँ से फोन आ जाता है और समस्या की हल का मैसेज भी आ जाता है। ये देखो आ गया।
अरे वाह, इसका मतलब इंतजार की घड़ी अब खत्म।
हाँ।
तभी मैं सोचूं कि आजकल मुझ पर इतना प्यार क्यों आ रहा है।
कृषि संबंधी समस्याओं का अपनी भाषा में तुरंत हल पाने के लिए पूरे भारत में किसी भी फोन से हेल्पलाइन नंबर पर संपर्क करें। किसानों का दोस्त किसान कॉल सेंटर।
Welcome back. You're watching Candid Conversation. Our guest this week is noted economist and member of Niti Aayog, Bibek Debroy. Mr. Debroy, you headed a committee that made recommendations on restructuring of railways. You're currently also looking at this domain besides others in Niti Aayog. The cabinet recently made a decision to have a rail development authority, which was also one of your recommendations. Was that long overdue? What are the other major reforms that the railways should adopt?
Well, in the committee report that you mentioned, we flagged 5, and I will quickly, almost in bulleted form, mention these 5. One was, as you said, the development authority, although we called it a regulator. The second was allowing private sector entry, which policy-wise has already been done. It's now a question of implementing it. The next one was decentralization, because the railways have become over-centralized over time. That's also progressively being done. We also talked about commercial accounting. This has already been done on pilot basis in one division and one zone, and by 2019 all of the railways should have it. The only one which is still in the works is where we recommended a breakdown of the silo system that exists in the railways because of the way officers are recruited through 7 different streams. We wanted it to be unified. So if you look at it in terms of our 5 major planks of reforms, 80% has been implemented. But do realize these are not binary kinds of things, that today the reforms are not there, tomorrow I implement the reform. These are incremental. So incrementally the reforms are actually being implemented.
Okay, so you are saying that reforms in HR is something that still need to roll out, whereas incremental progress has started on the other recommendations that you made. You're also a votary, Mr. Debroy, of a leaner system of governance wherein the obsolete laws should be repealed. There should be fewer number of government departments. That is, their number should be rationalized. What is the kind of ground that we have covered in the center, which you prefer to call Union of States, and the states, some of them if you can share with us on these counts?
Well, some of the things that have been done are, for example, you mentioned the repeal of old laws. The repeal part is the easy part because of the stroke of a pen, you're just repealing old dysfunctional laws. Altogether, almost 1,200 old central union government statutes have been repealed through 4 bills. Not too many people know about this. So out of a total base of about 2,500, 2 bills, 2015 and 2016, removed about 1,200 of them. The ones that remain need to be harmonized and unified and rationalized. That takes a little bit of time. Now some work is happening on that. So far as things that are administrative in nature, several things have been done. Self-certification online. You probably know that there is an exercise to rationalize the tribunals and reduce the number of tribunals. There is an exercise to make things IT dependent, so you reduce the human interface. But you started off with a question of rationalizing government departments and ministries. One must remember that some of these things are not a 2014 agenda. Some of these things are a 2019 agenda. So I would say rationalizing ministries and departments is more of a 2019 agenda, because especially, I mentioned this earlier, I mentioned the decentralization and fiscal devolution. Once these gain ground, then there are ministries that no longer need to exist, but that's somewhere down the line, not immediately in 2017.
On the question of judicial activism, you have written in the past, in fact you've asked a question in your articles, that whether this is government underreach or judicial overreach. A similar debate is on in the context of the Supreme Court's order imposing curbs on liquor sales. Would you like to weigh in on that?
And be hauled up for contempt of court. There is a piece of legislation called the Contempt of Court Act. No, but I do think, I'm making this comment not only about courts, not just about the Supreme Court, but about also legislature, parliament, as well as state assemblies. Quite often we tend to think that the solution to a problem is a piece of law, whether it is a statute or whether it is through case law. Quite often the solution is not necessarily a piece of legislation or case law, which sometimes becomes very difficult to enforce, and even if it is enforced, it imposes very, very high costs. So very politely and tactfully what I'm trying to say is that while judicial activism has brought about some good effects, there has also been significant overreach. And one of the things that one should ask, and this is what Britain experimented with earlier in the context of statutes, but I'm going to extend it to court judgments also. Why do I need this particular statute? What happens if I don't have that statute? What are the benefits and what are the costs? And do a proper cost-benefit analysis before in a hurry I pass one particular piece of legislation. And I would suggest that the same thing should be done, not by some outsider, but by the judges themselves when they pass any kind of order.
Okay. Let's come to your interests in Sanskrit now. Tell us what triggered it in the first place. Was it by accident or was it by design?
Well, most things in life are by accident. So it's not, again, it's a bit like the railway reforms. It's not a here today, gone tomorrow. It's not like that. It's incremental over a period of time. It became a bit more serious about 10 years ago when I got more confident about my proficiency in Sanskrit to do the translation a bit more seriously. I'd been doing the translations earlier, and it began with a translation that I did of the Bhagavad Gita about 10 years ago, and then I translated the unabridged in English. I'm not talking about the vernacular. Unabridged Mahabharata in 10 volumes. This is the third such translation in English. Many people think there are several translations. There aren't. There is 3 now. Then I've done the Harivansha. I have also done the Valmiki Ramayana, which has not yet been published, will be published later this year. And I am now embarked on this very hazardous journey of doing all the 18 major Puranas, the Mahapuranas. The reason this is hazardous is taken together, they will be 4 times the size of the Mahabharata, which I just said was in 10 volumes. So it will be close to about, I don't know, 15 million, 20 million words.
How do you manage your time with all this? Because you have several assignments with you as member of Niti Aayog. Is time management a challenge, and what keeps you motivated?
Well, time management is a challenge. It used to be easier before I joined Niti Aayog, because before I joined Niti Aayog, on an average, I used to be able to carve out the time to do something like 1,500 to 2,000 words a day, which is the target if I'm going to accomplish what I intend to accomplish. So either 1,500 to 2,000 words a day or perhaps 2 hours, same thing. Now it's become a little bit more difficult to carve out the time. So these days I can usually carve out the time only when I'm traveling, meaning on flights or when I'm sitting in some hotel or the other. What keeps me going, I think the answer to that is the answer that any author would actually give you. I'm not getting into metaphysical and spiritual stuff here. Any author would give you the answer that I'm doing this because there's an urge inside that's driving me to do this. And that is essentially what drives it.
You have said that to say that Sanskrit is dead is a great exaggeration, and you also said that a lot needs to be done to encourage the language. So what should be done?
I think the basic problem is with the way it is taught and the kind of teachers we have. Because Sanskrit, if we are going to correct the way Sanskrit is taught, we need to begin with the school system. And we need to teach it the way we teach any other language or we learn any other language, which is not by mugging up grammar tables, but just conversing in it. That's how all of us learned various languages. You begin to speak, you begin to converse in it, you make mistakes, and you're corrected. So that's how we need to teach Sanskrit. Unfortunately, it's got bogged down in grammar tables, and it completely puts off a prospective student.
Do our scriptures, Mr. Deb Roy, provide any answers to the problems that we see with regard to governance or to the question of inclusive development?
Firstly, there is a lot on governance, not just in Kautilya's Arthashastra, but also in significant sections in the Mahabharata, when Bhishma is lying down on his bed of arrows and is teaching Yudhishthira and his brothers on Rajadharma, the duty of kings. Now, all of that is about what we would today call governance. A lot of the governance then used to be done by the community, by the citizens. Many of the things that we expect the government to do today were in that day and age actually done by citizens. For example, things like MRP. Who set the MRP? The Srenis, the guilds did. Who did skill development? The Srenis and the guilds did. Who did
bottom-up decision making?
Yes, but by the community, not by the government. It's not panchayats in that sense. Take something like the work of the Competition Commission of India. Who did that? The Srenis did. Somewhere down the line, we've lost that heritage, and therefore we constantly clamor for the government to do this, that, and the other. But the other aspect to it is, if one is talking about the scriptures, and now I'm going to use the word dharma. Dharma is not only about your relationship with the external world. Words like governance and what do I do with reforms, these are about your relationship with the external world, external objects, other people. Dharma is fundamentally about your relationships with yourself. So it is not about the external world, it's about what is internal to you. And that is even more important than the external part.
How has your work on the epics influenced you?
Influenced me or changed me? I will first say what I always say, which is that I'm not the right person to ask that question. You should really ask my wife, because she says that I have changed. So far as I'm concerned, it is about what you lose, not what you gain. Now, what do I mean by that? We get unnecessarily addicted to all kinds of instant emotions, whether it is anger or whether it is something else. What I know it has consciously done to me is made me a lot less attached. So it doesn't really matter, because these things are transient. What is permanent is much more valuable. So I guess that is the way it has changed me. But maybe you should do an interview with my wife.
Maybe that's up next. Well, Mr. Deb Roy, it was lovely speaking to you, and all the very best for the future projects that you've already begun working on, and many more that would come in future. And I must reiterate what I said in the beginning, that you are someone who wears so many hats with so much ease. Thank you for having joined us in Candid Conversation.
Thank you.